to the double percussion concerto duo Duel by Jennifer Higdon, a work premiered in May 2022 and played there by Svet, Stoyanov and Matthew Strauss, for whom it was written, with the Houston Symphony Orchestra conducted by Robert Spano and just released by Naxos. I'm James Jolly and welcome to this Gramophone podcast, which this week is produced in association with the Lake George Music Festival, where you can enjoy classical music among some of America's most spectacular scenery. Visit lakegeorgemusicfestival.com to find out more. I caught up with Jennifer Higdon recently and we started by talking about the other work on the new album, her Concerto for Orchestra of 2002. Well, it's quite rare for a substantial contemporary piece of music to have three recordings currently available, because your Concerto for Orchestra, obviously there's what I take to be the premiere performance under Sawallisch. Then Robert Spano in Atlanta recorded it, and now he's returned to the work in Houston. I mean, that must be quite thrilling for a composer.
It is pretty amazing. And you know, when we did this in Houston in 2015, we didn't know it was going to end up on a recording. What basically happened is Houston was the lead commissioner on my double percussion concerto, Duel. And they said, well, we would like to release this. They said, what else can we put on here? And I said, well, you did the Concerto for Orchestra. I think at that point it was 6 years previously. I said, why don't you take a listen and see, even though we didn't set that up for a recording, I think it was literally just archival microphones over the stage. I said, check it and see if you think this is releasable. And amazingly, it was. I think that's the miraculous part to me. But it is an extraordinary compliment to have such a large work come out 3 times. I mean, who gets to do that, really?
Well, I was going to say, I think you probably have to go back to someone like John Tavener and the Protecting Veil to get, multiple recordings of the same piece. No, and it's not, I mean, it's a big piece. It's sort of, it's almost like a different era. I mean, do you still get commissions for works of that size, or have people kind of eased back a bit? Because I think certainly this side of the pond, a new work is generally quite small.
Well, it's amazing. I actually have so many commissions. Right now I'm going up to 2026. I had to stop the orchestra commissions because during the pandemic, when we were locked down, and Philadelphia was locked down quite a long time, I think I did 4 orchestral works and I did something like 8 chamber works during that time. But I mean, I have been turning down things. On Sunday, I was at a festival, the Colorado Music Festival, and Josh Bell played the pre-premiere, basically, of a new violin concerto that has 5 composers who've written movements, and I was one of them. So I have to admit, I have a tremendous number of orchestra works going out. I have a Cold Mountain suite, which was taken from my first opera, that had 37 co-commissioners. These were for smaller orchestras, and I think last season we had 18 do the work, and I think this year we have probably 19 doing it. 19 orchestras are doing it. So I'm very lucky. I've had so many recordings come out in the past year. I may have been the only person I know who was busy all the way through the pandemic, but the commissions are stacked up. I can't believe how lucky I am to work with such incredible musicians and to get a chance to have works performed. Really, it's just kind of a miraculous thing.
Are you a very organised composer? I mean, do you kind of get up and say, right, 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, I'm going to start, I'm going to work till lunch, and then...
Yes, I think you have to be. I write every day. I've started taking 1 day off a week, but I write 4 to 6 hours a day if I'm not on the road, in order to be able to stay on top of the commission deadlines, because I know what I have going into 2026, so it means that I really have to be disciplined. And I'm not teaching, so for me, my life is just composing, and I'm extremely lucky. But I get up in the morning, it's the first thing I do. I eat breakfast, I work out, I eat breakfast, and then I start composing, and I return in the afternoon after lunch and I compose. So it's, even when I'm on the road, I'm doing things like parts, which sounds strange, but the things I can do on the road that don't take as much energy for me is sitting down and actually trying to create something from nothing.
Do you have a sort of notion as to how fast you work? So if I came to you and I said, I want a 15-minute overture to start a concert, would you say, well, that'll take me 2 months?
Yes,
or
that's it.
5 months?
Yeah, no, exactly, 2 months. This was the interesting thing I thought about during the pandemic, because I think the stress for everyone was so intense that writing in the beginning saved me in a certain way, but I was only able to write at the very beginning an hour a day before I was just exhausted. I was very fortunate too because I had managed to start a piece 3 weeks before the lockdown happened, which meant that I was already involved in a project that kind of kept my head thinking about a little bit about that. Because the composers I know who had not started something before the pandemic had a really hard time writing during the event itself. And ironically, it was the double percussion concerto. It was just a weird fluke that I had just started that work. But I also, once we got locked down, I thought, well, we don't know when we're going to come out of this. I was scheduled to deliver the piece to the soloists at the beginning of July. And I thought, I need to keep myself on course because if we restart concerts, they're going to need that. And then I thought, oh, the piece is so hard, they're going to need that anyway. Even if it's delayed, I might as well just go ahead and write like crazy and give them the parts and they could work on it during the lockdown. I did that with several pieces, including my second opera. I'm like, well, I'll go ahead and get it to the singers in case they're bored, and they want to learn it. So there was kind of strategic thinking on my part that way.
Yeah, because it seems that a lot of musicians I've spoken to latterly, that there were two ways they went. Either they worked really hard and they thought, well, this is a real opportunity to do this or do that or tackle this I've never done. And the others were, actually, I'm never going to get this sort of time again. I'm going to forget about it all. And there wasn't much in between.
That's true.
No, turning to these two works on this new album, they were written 18 years apart. So the Concerto for Orchestra 2002, the Duel 2020.
Right.
Let's go back to the Concerto for Orchestra. That's kind of ancient history now for you because it's a good 2 decades. But what were the circumstances? It was written for Philadelphia and its then music director Wolfgang Sawallisch who gave the premiere. But was there a kind of brief?
There was. It's interesting. These two pieces are actually connected. I don't think people know this story, but basically the Philadelphia Orchestra said, well, they were commissioning 7 different composers for I think it was their centennial celebration. And I was the last one, and I was the one unknown one. And I knew the percussionists really well in the percussion section, and I thought, oh, I got to write something just for them, a Concerto for Orchestra is showing off sections anyway. So when I came up with the idea, I'm not sure Maestro Sawallisch was too convinced. He wasn't really wild about percussion. But I tried to make sure that was also the quietest the moment in that entire 30-minute piece. And what ended up happening, the Philadelphia Orchestra was so happy with how it turned out and the reception that they came back within months and said, do you want to write another piece for us? Would you like to write a percussion concerto for Colin Currie? It literally was that fast. Maren Alsop was scheduled to conduct. She had met Colin at the Cabrillo Festival. She said, why don't you say something to the orchestra and I'll say something? And so I wrote my percussion concerto for Colin Currie. That was the next commission with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And they had noted, I think, particularly that percussion movement. It's ironic because the 2022 BBC Young Artist winner, Jordan Ashman, just won with that percussion concerto. That percussion concerto and the Concerto for Orchestra is what prompted Svet Stoyanov and Matthew Strauss, the two soloists in Duel, to ask for a double percussion concerto. And it's ironic because what ended up happening when Houston did this back in 2015, I didn't know this, I just found this out last week. Matthew Strauss, who plays in the Houston Symphony, called Svet, who had just done my percussion concerto in Miami, and he said, we need to get Jennifer to write us a double percussion concerto. So that Concerto for Orchestra triggered that first percussion concerto and also the double percussion concerto. So I know percussionists are always asking me for music now, and I've written a lot because of that Concerto for Orchestra. But I feel fortunate when I got that commission, there was like a couple of years gap between getting the commission and the premiere. And it was fairly panic-inducing living in the town where everybody knew me and the Philadelphia Orchestra. I just come out of my doctoral program. I think everyone was like, why did they commission her? So I allowed extra time for that Concerto for Orchestra, probably more than I've allowed for any other pieces besides operas, which always take a lot of time. But they're connected, which kind of blows my mind because their DNA is actually pretty different. Because you're right, I've learned so much since then. And these two guys, Svet and Matt, had a special request. They were aware of my other concertos, my violin concerto that I wrote for Hilary Hahn, my viola concerto, my piano concerto. And they said to me, we really want something melodic like Violinist Skit. They were very specific about that. They said, everybody knows we can play drums, but we want something with melody and something that's catchy. They actually had a very specific request. And I thought, okay, well, that's a nice challenge. I'd never thought about percussion in the same way that I would think about a violin, but I thought, I've got time, we're in a pandemic, let me see if I can figure out how to do it. And that turned out to be a wonderful balm for my soul, because I was so distressed early on at the orchestra's closing down and the fact that we didn't have music making in person, that I felt like my heart and soul were reaching out in that double percussion concerto. It's very melodic, but I could also feel that I was trying to also involve the orchestra a lot more melodically, because I wanted us to be back together again, making music. And I only realize that now looking back. It was probably something very instinctive, but I can feel that urgency. It comes across in the concerto as very energetic. It's kind of trying to remind everyone we will make music again. We will be back in the concert hall, and this will be a good experience. We can do it. So that piece, I think because I worked on it through the first several months of the lockdown, it has that kind of, it's an anxious energy, but it's also trying to reassure everyone that we're on the same journey together.
The Duel is interesting because I suspect there was almost a kind of layout problem you had to grapple with, because looking at the photograph, the two percussionists are at the front of the stage, sort of just behind the conductor, and their instruments in an arc go around the podium. So there are timpani on either side.
Right.
And then there's a shared instrument in the middle. I mean, did that take a bit of kind of pushing and shoving to decide how it was going to work spatially?
Absolutely. And my original thought was they would be on the back side behind the conductor, and I had to literally calculate the space. So with percussion, you can go berserk and cover the front of the stage, but I try to be practical enough to realize that this is going to be on different size stages. So when I started, I thought, all right, I can make the most out of the marimba and the vibraphone by having them share the instruments. And they both wanted to play timpani, so I thought, okay, that can be out front. But I had them behind the conductor, so they were the ones who moved themselves at a kind of a V in front of the conductor. But the piece moved so fast that they really needed to be in front for those really fast sections, including the biggest thing was actually the cadenza, getting in and out of it. It's probably the fastest cadenza that has ever been written. I had to think about, because they play together on same instruments, how much room would be between them and the orchestra so they could move effectively. So the planning was really extensive. Houston Symphony said, we got like 20 timpani, you can use whatever you want. I said, well, this is going to other orchestras. Let's be practical and use the right timpani size where people aren't having to rent other instruments. Because I thought about what other orchestras are going through. Because one of the commissioners was the Miami Frost School, University of Miami. So I had to think about the logistics, but I always do. With percussion, that's a paramount theme because it's a dance. It is a dance on top of being an actual performance. You have to think all the time. But it also makes it kind of fun.
Do you find it inspiring to be writing for a specific person or a specific ensemble rather than somebody just says, I want a violin concerto and it's got to be 35 minutes, give or take? I mean, do you find it more inspiring to say, I, Hilary Hahn, want a violin concerto, and then you can go off, find out what you like about the way she plays, what her strengths are, what she does really well. I mean, how does it work? Because, some composers actually like a fairly abstract setting. I'm just going to write a symphony. And others say, no, I want to know exactly who I'm writing for. I want to know the sound of the orchestra, blah, blah, blah. I mean, where do you fall in?
I'm completely on that. I want to know the performers because I want to know what they find natural. When I wrote a bluegrass concerto for Time for Three, those guys are very different, and that's the piece I wrote after Hilary's violin concerto. I talked to the performers a lot and asked them what would they like in their concerto. When I was writing that violin concerto, she was great. She said, I want a major concerto. I'm like, what does that mean to you? I had to ask. And for her, it came down to meaty thematic material that's well developed and is 30 minutes long. That's how she described it. And as I sent her each movement, she kept saying, you can make it harder. You can make it harder. So the first movement was the last movement that I actually wrote. And I thought, all right, she's thrown down the gauntlet. I have to really make this a piece that's really challenging for fingering, because Hilary can pretty much do everything and do it well. So I always ask, and I'm lucky in that I always know my performers. But a composer makes like 1 million decisions, and it helps me to have like 4 of them made before I begin, because the soloist has said, I want this, I want this. I think that stuff is, for me, it's inspiring. It doesn't feel limiting. It actually helps me on my journey, because I want to find something that will fit the performer or the orchestra or both. And sometimes I even ask what's on the program with it to figure out what might make a good contrast and kind of hold up well with a standard piece of repertoire.
I mean, anybody who looks at the track listing and sees Concerto for Orchestra commissioned by a major American orchestra, oh, it's got 5 movements. I mean, obviously, what I'm referring to in the back of all this is the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra written for Kusevitsky's Boston, also with 5 movements. I mean, was the 5 movements stipulated, or did it just sort of happen?
That's a really good question. When I got the commission, the day I learned about it, I listened to the Bartók one more time, and then I put it away. And I didn't listen to it for I think it was like 3 years till I'd finished the Concerto for Orchestra, because I was afraid, I love that piece so much, I was afraid I would rewrite it. I didn't think about the 5 movements in the Bartók, but what I did think about when I was designing the Concerto for Orchestra was everyone talks about the Philadelphia string sound. So I thought, all right, I want 1 movement that focuses on the string sound. So that made up my mind it had to be just strings. I had so many principal players in the Philadelphia Orchestra asking for solos, basically. So I thought, all right, 1 movement has to be solos. And then I got excited thinking about the percussion section, which I've worked with in chamber settings. I thought, all right, 1 movement has to be percussion. I thought, well, everybody's got to play in the outer movements as a unit. So the determination basically came about because I was thinking about the Philadelphia Orchestra and what I wanted to highlight in that ensemble. I hadn't really thought about the Bartók being 5 movements, but then when I went back and listened, I'm like, oh yeah, there definitely is a connection. And I'm sure on a subconscious level, because I love that piece so much, it was there.
Reading your notes to this album, I mean, you refer a couple of times, I think, to the fact that you don't necessarily compose a work in order, or shall I say, in the order that, the public will hear it. I mean, is that a complicated thing? I mean, do you sort of map out how the overall shape of a piece, and because you were just saying, you didn't necessarily start with the first movement, you started with a third movement. I mean, is it difficult to sort of, as it were, go backwards when you're composing?
Not really. If you make the pre-composition planning to figure out kind of a structure and figure out what the challenges are, and sometimes I don't get in my head, I don't come up with the ideas for the music in order. Hillary's violin concerto was fairly intimidating because before I wrote a note, she said, I'm recording this with a Tchaikovsky. And I thought, oh, I wish I hadn't known that. But, I knew it. There was nothing I could do to make that go away. So I thought, all right, where do I start? It's a big piece. And the first thing that popped into my head was slow music. And I thought, well, she picks a lot of traditional concertos, so I'm going to make the middle movement a slow movement as we traditionally have. Because those were the first ideas, that's the first thing I wrote. And what I do is I kind of go on faith and hope some idea will present itself, and I try to figure out where it fits in the overall piece. And so it's not, for me, a challenge. It actually kind of enables my instinctive creative brain. It's kind of an interesting thing, but it is fascinating. I keep real close tabs, though, to the track of the timing each of the movements, because I want to respect what an orchestra has requested, because sometimes they have real restrictions on the timing of a concert, especially in the United States. They know they want to do some major symphony or traditional work on the second half, and I think about that. So I keep close tabs on the timing on each movement. But it actually helps me to try to be a little more succinct in what I'm doing.
You're obviously a very busy composer. I mean, you were saying, you've got projects which will take you into 2026. What is your relationship with a work once it's composed and performed? Are you like a parent who basically says, right, I brought you up, off you go out into the world, you find your own way? Or are you one who's constantly, ringing up and saying, is everything all right? Can I do anything? I mean, once a work, like the Concerto for Orchestra has flown the nest, what's your relationship with it?
It's pretty much out in the world on its own, although I must admit the first several performances of a piece, and I'm lucky that I have multiple performances, I do tweak to make sure all of the dynamics are correct, that the gestures are working in the orchestra. Normally the soloist has told me whether it's working or not. And I know with Duel, there was quite a bit of tweaking because it was basically, I think, written in isolation. And I had a lot of stuff, but I had to adjust the dynamics through the rehearsal. And then the next 3 orchestras, I adjusted dynamics, even past the recording, to make sure everything worked optimally. Once I hit the point where it feels like it's working optimally, it goes out into the world. And I think in a year, I probably have 70 or 90 orchestra performances. So I just don't attend them, but I hope that they'll work. And occasionally someone will send a note back and say, oh, we found a wrong note here, or the pedaling's not working quite right on the harp, and I'll go back and change it. This is the beauty of being your own publisher. You can update everything. So, but pretty much the pieces are on their own. Once I've gotten them set with corrections and adjustments that make them work optimally from orchestra to orchestra.
In what kind of detail do you remember a piece of music? I mean, for example, if you come back to work and you haven't heard it for 10 years, does it sort of reappear in front of you automatically as if it's been there? Or do you suddenly think, gosh, I don't remember writing that? Or, wow, that was really quite a good idea. Or
That's a really good question. I have to review all the pieces before I go back to them. I mean, I wrote Josh Bell's movement for his piece this past December. Duel was being done this past Friday at the Cabrillo Festival. Josh's piece was done on Sunday, 2 days later at the Colorado Music Festival, and I have to carry scores with me and review everything. I usually write 10 to 12 works a year, so when it's going back to the Concerto for Orchestra, I have to review because I'm moving between recordings so fast and so many performances so fast that I'm not able to answer the questions sufficiently. I think I've had 4 or 5 recordings come out this year in the past 365 days to make sure that I'm talking to people about the right piece. You're the 3rd interview this week I review to make sure I'm on the right piece. It's a great issue to have, but my brain is thinking about the piano trio I'm working on right now and the 4-hand piano work for the Naughton sisters. I've got 2 pieces going simultaneously, and I just came off Josh's piece. I'm making the adjustments for the first performances in Hamburg coming up in like 2 weeks, and then it goes to Hong Kong. I'm trying to get all of his adjustments in while working on the 2 pieces that are actually being written right now. So it could make you crazy if you let it, but you try to keep your brain tracked on whatever piece is right in front of you at the moment and review before you go into the next piece's recording session or rehearsal to make sure you have the right elements. Where do the strings put the mutes on? What were the mallet issues for Duel when we moved to the Cabrillo Festival? So I try to be responsible because my duty is to the performers. Once I've written that piece, it's to make sure it's working for them in the type of hall they're in, at the skill level they're at. And I'm lucky because I work with such incredible groups. But this Cold Mountain Suite that I did this year had a bunch of youth orchestras. And that opera was written for Santa Fe Opera, which is a really highly skilled orchestra. So to make sure that things worked properly for youth orchestras, I had to go back and readjust some of the writing. I wanted it to be truthful to the music, to challenge the students, and the music is really hard, and which they have told me repeatedly when I've gone in with them. But I also want it to be so memorable that they say, oh my gosh, yes, that was worth the work. So the young trumpet player who comes to me, I think 3 orchestras, youth orchestras, the trumpet player, first trumpet, has come to me and said, this is the hardest thing I've ever played, but it was worth it. And, just looking at them and seeing the joy in their eyes, even though they were really challenged, is the very best part of my job. It just completely is inspiring. And when I go to these orchestras now, people come up to me all the time. They're like, when I was in honors orchestra, I played your Blue Cathedral. There was a young principal cellist of an orchestra here in the United States who said to me on Sunday, I didn't believe in new music until I played Blue Cathedral, and now I understand why I want to play. And he started crying when he told me this, and then I started crying. And I'm like, how lucky am I that people have that kind of response? It's exactly what we want music to do. We want it to move people to emotion, to let them speak through the music. Even though I'm writing it, it truly feels like it also belongs to the performers and the audience. It's not just my piece. It's really a chamber expression in the orchestra field, but it really is me and the orchestra and the soloist and the audience. And to me, and I know this is different for everyone, that's a big responsibility. For me, that's the imperative.
Another gratifying thing I would have thought would be when a commissioning orchestra they've done their premiere and someone else is going to have their crack at it. But if they come back to you and say, actually, we'd like to do it again.
Yeah.
I mean, that's nice, because you often think, you go to, I don't know, a prom and you hear a new work and you see that, it's going to be done in, I don't know, Hong Kong and San Francisco. And then you're thinking, well, I wonder what sort of life it'll have after that. And I wonder if any of those orchestras will come back to it, that's the ultimate accolade for an orchestra to say, actually, we so enjoyed it and the audience really loved it, we want to do it again.
It's true. It's very true. I mean, the Concerto for Orchestra happened to be, Philadelphia Orchestra did it again. It was Yannick Nézet-Séguin's very first American piece that he did in his tenure here. He came back to it. And I hear things in it with different conductors that I've never heard before. But that is absolutely ideal and just the ultimate compliment. The Munich Symphony, about a year and a half ago, premiered my mandolin concerto with Avi Avital, and they came back 2 months later and said, hey, do you have any other commissions we can come in on? And I was like, wow, that's an amazing compliment. I mean, yeah, it's a dream. It's what you want for all composers, to be quite honest. Everyone should have a chance to make the changes in the pieces, and I grow with each of these pieces. The Concerto for Orchestra is the perfect example. I feel like my writing has grown, and this is the perfect disc to see that, because it's a very recent piece and my first really major orchestra work with that Concerto for Orchestra. So it's what every composer should have.
Maybe we should just finish with a few words about Robert Spano, because, I mean, he's clearly one of your big champions, and the fact that he's recorded the work twice is quite remarkable, really.
It is, yeah. I met Robert Spano in 1985. Most people don't know this. I was an undergraduate. He came to my undergraduate school, took over the orchestra. We were both so young, we weren't able to get into Tanglewood. So he has advised me throughout my life, and I think he's recorded something like 7 of my pieces with different groups. And he and I have we don't even have to speak in rehearsals. We actually can tell we both think the same things. It's a pretty amazing thing to have with a conductor, but meeting a conductor when I was a student who also had just come out of school and was just starting his teaching, didn't even have an orchestra position, it's stunningly incredible. And I never would have guessed that when I met him when I was an undergraduate. It took 10 or 15 years before we worked together again, and he was the one who conducted the premiere of Blue Cathedral. It was just a fluke. He just was asked to do it. He didn't realize I had written the work, and I didn't realize he had been asked. But that kind of reconnected us, and that kind of relationship it's hugely important, because they sense what you want and where you're falling short, what you need to work on. And they also encourage you in places you may be blind to make adjustments, or also even in career steps. So it's kind of wonderful to watch his career grow also. It's been kind of an incredible experience.
It must be amazing to have your music kind of blossoming in the hands of a conductor who absolutely understands it, because I suspect he's done things that you were quite surprised about, and you just thought, well, actually, yes, it was there, but I probably would have never realized that myself.
That's true. That's a perfect, accurate statement. It really is.
Music from Jennifer Higdon's Concerto for Orchestra, played by the Houston Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Robert Spano, and just out from Naxos. This week's podcast was produced in association with the Lake George Music Festival, where you can enjoy classical music among some of America's most spectacular scenery. Visit lakegeorgemusicfestival.com to find out more. Gramophone's hunt for its 2023 Orchestra of the Year is underway. Just head over to gramophone.co.uk/awards to see the 10 shortlisted ensembles. You can also listen to the 10 specially curated playlists on Apple Music Classical and vote for your favourite orchestra by September the 7th. The result will be revealed on October the 4th. Gramophone podcasts are free, but if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone magazine. Over 13 issues a year, we bring you hundreds of reviews by our expert critics, as well as in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases and the most exciting musicians of the day. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support, and consider leaving a review or rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.